Argument mapping is the job today. We saw the very beginning of argument mapping on Tuesday, where we learned the difference between dependent and independent premises. What we're going to do today is basically just that, but more of it. So every argument that you looked at on Tuesday had just two premises and a conclusion, and your job was just to figure out, are these two premises dependent or are they independent? Now we're going to do sort of like more complex structures where there are a wider variety of relationships that the premises could take, but they're all composed of just those two, either dependently leading to a conclusion or independently. So most of what we're going to do today is just exercises. So if you could take one and pass it along. I have a couple of concepts to talk about just at the beginning. So I'll talk just a little bit about a few of the concepts that I've already been kind of using without properly explaining. But most of this section will be just doing these exercises. Okay? Couple of quick bits of course mechanics first. I've been told that we have to move one day in November. We're going to have to not meet in this hall. We're going to have to meet in the gym. This is a super nice hall, and they want it for the big annual something or other. I can't remember what it is, but something that's more important than us. Sorry. So one day we'll move to the gym, November 16th. There'll be a projector and everything, so we should be okay. Also, the thing that I meant to announce a couple weeks ago and couldn't remember, I remembered. It's this, that for the tests and the exam, you're not allowed to bring any aids, so no cheat sheets or notes or anything like that, but you can bring a paper dictionary. That can be just like an English dictionary, or it can be like an English to another language dictionary. So the point of this class is not to test whether you know the meaning of words. The point is to test whether you understand how arguments work. So dictionaries are fine. We'll flip through them to make sure there's nothing funny in them, but I hope that helps. People reported in the past that that's kind of helpful. Anybody still looking for one of the handouts? Everybody who has one wants one? If there's extras, please bring them down. Okay, are there any questions about course mechanics? Any questions about what we're doing, where we are? Good. Okay, so I'm just going to put out a couple of concepts here. I think I've been using these concepts. I've been saying these words in class and not really properly explaining them, so let me just do that right now. And here's the first one. So deductive and inductive validity. So the questions we're going to do, the exercises we're going to do, ask you to map the arguments and tell me whether they're valid or invalid. But I want to distinguish two ways that an argument can be at least kind of valid. So when philosophers say valid, what they mean is deductively valid. And that means that the premises guarantee the conclusion. But really, most of the arguments that you see in life aren't like that. Uncertainty is everywhere, and vagueness and ambiguity. So most of the arguments that you see are going to be inductively valid. Let's say that. So there's not really good words for like the middle ground between deductive validity and being just invalid. So let's call it inductive validity when an argument raises the probability. So this one on the left is deductive. Everyone over 30 wears glasses. I'm over 30, therefore I wear glasses. That is a perfectly deductive inference. Okay, that's got the maximum possible logical strength, right? So that if the premises were true, and clearly one of the premises is false, right? Not everybody over 30 wears glasses. But if they were true, it would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Right? So it's perfectly deductively valid, despite the fact that one of its premises is clearly false. Right? Its conclusion is true, but it only happens to be true, or something like that. Right? The one on the right is inductive. All dogs are cute. Cats are similar to dogs. Therefore, cats are cute. Right? So even if those first two things were completely true, you were certain that they're true, that shouldn't make you certain of the conclusion. However, I would suggest that it's at least some evidence. It's not zero evidence. It's pretty weak evidence, right? Just saying two things are similar really doesn't mean that you can just take any property that you like of one and apply it to the other. You have to be similar in appearance for cuteness to transfer over, or something like that, right? So it's a much weaker inference. It's a much weaker argument, but it is nonetheless a valid argument in the inductive sense. Okay, so let me unpack that a little bit in terms of this possible world stuff. So let me just go through deductive validity 3 different ways, and I think they say the same thing, basically. So an argument is deductively valid if there's no possibility that the premises can be true while the conclusion is false. Just another way of putting that, the premises of a deductive argument guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Now here's another slightly weirder way of putting it, that's how philosophers talk. There is no possible world in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false. This is, since the 70s or so, this is how philosophers have talked about possibilities, in terms of possible worlds. So inductive validity is just, it's similar, but it's not the same. So an argument is inductively valid if, were the premises true, they would, let's say, raise the probability that the conclusion is true. Right? So it makes it more likely. The premises of an inductive argument make the conclusion more likely than if the premises weren't true. And I guess the way to put this in the possible worlds thing is, there are possible worlds in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false, but maybe not that many. There are fewer possible worlds, or something like that. So this possible worlds talk is weird, very weird, and I don't really recommend that you interpret it literally. So Saul Kripke got this started, interpreting what's called modal claims in terms of possible worlds talk. So when you say something is possible, or it's necessary, or it's contingent, or something like that, you're saying something about what we call all possible worlds. Some people, there's at least one famous philosopher who insists that this talk is literally true. That is, that they really are, for any logically possible state of affairs, there is a universe in which those affairs are true. And when you say something is necessary, what you're saying is that it's true in all of those possible worlds. That's David Lewis. Very few people believe that. I'm not pitching that to you as a good way of believing this universe is, but it is a helpful way of speaking and thinking because it sort of gives you a tool for getting your imagination around what's called counterfactual claims. So to get a little more specific, they're not just imagining universes. A possible world for philosophers is like it's like a list of statements. So start from the actual world and say, okay, imagine a list of all of the facts about the universe. Suppose you listed out all of the facts that would describe our universe completely. Long list, but you can imagine it, right? There's an electron here, there's a proton there, so on and so forth, right? So really, really long list, maybe infinitely long, but there's a list of facts about our world. Now, you can imagine any one of those facts being changed, right? The electron isn't here, it's over here, or something like that, right? So of all of the alterations you could make to that list of facts, there's a corresponding alternate list of facts, which we call a possible world, right? So the cup is on the table. Well, there's a logically possible world where the cup is not on the table. And that iterated for every object in the universe. Philosophers like to argue about which objects should be included in that. Should it be just fundamental particles in that list, or are there like people and ecosystems and all that stuff is in the list as well? But we don't have to worry about that. So that's what we mean by a possible world. We mean a consistent description of the whole universe, not just this planet, but the whole universe. So when we say in all possible worlds, triangles have 3 sides, what we're saying is in every consistent description of the universe, in any consistent description of a universe, triangles have 3 sides, right? So we could also sort of narrow the scope of possibility that we're considering. So sometimes philosophers talk about physically possible worlds. So that's all of the descriptions that are compatible, not just logically coherent with itself, but like that follow the laws of physics. So for any physically possible configuration, there's a number of descriptions that would not violate the laws of physics. So you can have a more constrained set of possible worlds. Okay, so that's modal semantics. It's weird, but it's kind of helpful for thinking about these things. So conditionals and categoricals. So it's helpful for thinking about conditionals, it's helpful for thinking about necessity, and it's helpful for thinking about validity. And that, by the way, is basically the philosopher who takes that stuff literally's argument that, look, this talking about possible worlds is so handy in so many places in philosophy that we should just say that it's probably true. Few people have followed him on that, but that's his argument anyway. Okay, so conditionals and categoricals. Categoricals are things like all x's are y, and we saw that Aristotle's logic was framed largely in terms of categorical statements. So all dogs are cute, all squares have 4 sides, are categorical claims. They say everything that's a member of this category has this property. Right? And a tightly related class of claims are conditionals. So a conditional is if x, then y. And you can see here that you can sort of translate conditionals into categoricals and categoricals into conditionals. So if it's true that all dogs are cute, if I give you that as a premise, you can infer that if anything, if any object in the universe is a dog, falls under that category, then it has that property of cuteness, right? So you can sort of go back and forth between categoricals and conditionals like this, assuming that the conditional or the categorical is a strict one. You don't want to have fuzzy boundaries or this doesn't work. But so those are categoricals and conditionals. And of course you can translate them. So just like this, all birds fly is the categorical, applies the property of being able to fly to the condition or to the category. And you can say that just in another way of if an object is a bird, then that object flies. Okay? So categoricals, conditionals, these are kind of basic elements that you would use in an argument. Yeah, question?
What if it doesn't use the word all?
Right. The question is, what if it doesn't use the word all, they just say birds fly? That is genuinely complicated. So the statement, just the sentence birds fly is what's called a generic. A generic is something that says, generally, this is true. And a generic statement is not translatable into a categorical statement or well, it's kind of categorical, but it's not a strict categorical statement. It's not translatable into a conditional. So if I say birds fly, and then I say penguins are a bird, therefore penguins fly, we've obviously made a mistake there, right? Right? Because penguins can't fly. Right, so in a generic, you're saying mostly this category has this, but then you can't infer, you can't use that. So what you can do with a conditional statement is say all members of the category have this thing's a member of the category, therefore this thing has that thing. And you cannot do that with a generic. Yeah?
So then if we use birds fly, then that comes with a deductive argument, right?
It makes it so, yeah, so the comment is can you make a deductive argument from a generic? Well, you probably cook up some way. Like you can't do that deduction that I just said. You can't do the classic modus ponens, you can't do the classic modus tollens. Or if you try, you're always just going to be under risk. Like it's a risky inference, it's not a deductive inference. So we should talk more about generics as the course goes on, because people get really tripped up on this. I don't know if you've ever heard this exchange. Like somebody uses a generic like all men are pigs, or men are pigs. And you say, well, I'm not a pig. And we say, well, you didn't say you're a pig. And it's they're offering a generic that then gets interpreted as a universal claim, or they're offering something that's a universal claim that they really think is just a generic. So getting really clear on the difference between saying something universal says all members whatsoever of the category have it, and saying like usually the members of the category have it are very, very different claims, and you can do different things with them inferentially. And the trick is that English doesn't distinguish. When you say a generic, birds fly, it could equally well be interpreted as all birds fly or generally birds fly, or even there exists some flying birds. So like say dogs do tricks. Not all dogs do tricks, and maybe even not most dogs do tricks, but there do exist dogs who can do tricks, so dogs do tricks. So English is just systematically ambiguous on, you give somebody a generic sentence and it's just not marked explicitly in the language what they mean by it, and you either have to ask them or infer from context or something like that. Yeah. So those are tricky, and I think we'll talk about those again as the course goes on. So when we're talking about clarifying meaning and stuff like that. Okay? Very good. Okay, so to connect this up with the argument mapping stuff, categoricals and conditionals can both enter into dependent relations, right? Those are the kind of things that are standard in dependent relations. I think there's probably a couple others that could enter into them, like that are sort of logically related, but these are the big ones. These are the most common ones. So If it's snowing, then the roads will be slippery. It is snowing, therefore the roads will be slippery. And you can see how the puzzle piece method applies there, right? So there's this common part between the first two sentences that then drops out in the conclusion. All dogs are mammals. Mammals are warm-blooded. Therefore, all dogs are warm-blooded. Again, the common bit in the two first sentences, mammals, drops out, and the conclusion is just sort of the smushed together result of the remainder. Yeah? Okay. So I think it's worth talking a little bit about the conditionals specifically. Much philosophy is done on it, and I think I even use these terms without putting them up on the slides, so let me just sort of do some housekeeping here. So there's two parts of a conditional, the antecedent and the consequent, or the antecedent is also sometimes called. So if it is raining is the antecedent, then the sidewalks will be wet is the consequent. And I want to warn you up front, lots of people are tempted when you're doing argument diagrams, when you're trying to break down an argument, lots of people are tempted to make the antecedent one premise and the consequent another premise, to separate a sentence like this into two premises. And that's wrong. Don't do that for reasons that we'll get into in just a second, because you're not assessing the truth. When you're assessing the truth of a whole conditional, it comes as a package, right? You have to assess the whole conditional all at once, not the truth of the antecedent and the truth of the consequent, right? You're not saying that these could be true or false separately. You're just assessing the whole thing. So it's currently true. It is true as far as I know most of the world most of the time that if it's raining, then the sidewalks are wet, right? But that's true here now today, despite the fact that it's beautiful and sunny outside, right? So the conditional if then is true, despite the fact that the antecedent is false. Right? So this is a bit weird. This is what's called a counterfactual. So it says something about what would be the case if something was true. I mean, the cup is on the table is a fact that's made true or false only by what's actually happening right here, right now, in this actual world, right? But the conditional doesn't work like that. The conditional says something about other possible worlds, possibly. So this is one of the standard analyses of conditionals. You might be surprised to know that philosophers in the 21st century are still wrestling with the question of what it really means to say if-then, but we are. So here's a couple of attempts, and these are very much disputed attempts. So both of these have been criticized, but they're the best kind of around, so I'll share them with you. So according to David Lewis, who I am not, as far as I know, related to, a conditional is true. He's the possible worlds guy, by the way. He's the one who's like, it's literally true that for any possible thing, there's a universe of it. And that furthermore, when we say things like if-then statements, the reference of our sentence is those other possible worlds. Okay? So he's saying a conditional is true when in the nearest possible world, where the antecedent is true, the conclusion is also true. And nearness in this sense, remember a possible world is really, we're talking about a list of statements. So he's saying in the possible world that's got a list of statements that's closest or most similar to the list of statements that describes our world, where if the antecedent is true, the consequent must also be true. So if it's raining, then the sidewalks will be wet, it's true, because in a world where you change nothing about the whole universe except whether it's raining outside right now, right, then the sidewalks would also be wet. Okay? So these are counterfactuals, and I want to emphasize people often use the word counterfactual to mean just something that's false. Like they use it as a derogatory term. So like his claim is counterfactual to mean like you're saying something that's wrong. But conditionals, true conditionals, are also counterfactuals. And you need these things to have a functioning mind, right? You need to be able to reason about possibilities in order to get through your day. So counterfactuals are crucially important to your thinking and reasoning and understanding and interacting with the world. They're not just a bunch of lies. But it's hard to say what they mean if you're not going to say something kind of weird like this. This is I hope you agree that this is a pretty weird analysis of what the word if-then means. I bet you didn't expect that to have something to do with an infinity of alternative universes. So here's another analysis that doesn't go quite so heavy on the metaphysics. So this is Frank Ramsey's version of how you evaluate the truth of conditionals. And he's not talking about like the metaphysics of the alternate universes. He's talking about beliefs. So he says this. Here's the test. Here's the Ramsey's test for whether a conditional is true or not. It says, to see whether you think a conditional is true, just imagine that the antecedent is true, and then ask yourself, is it now rational for me to believe the conclusion is true? Right? So it's really, this is about the structure of rationality. So Lewis's thing is about the kind of metaphysical structure of the multiverse, and this is a statement about rationality and the structure of what it would be reasonable to suppose based on what, right? So if the possible worlds thing seemed really bizarre to you, here's an alternative that's much less weird. One thing that you might worry about here, actually, let's do the example. So you should agree to the conditional, if hostile aliens invade, then we're all in deep trouble. If, when you imagine a world in which there are hostile aliens invading, we end up in deep trouble, right? And that is, your assenting to that conditional has absolutely nothing to do with whether you think aliens are going to invade, right? You can be 100% sure that that's not going to happen, but nonetheless believe the conditional that if they did, then this and that would follow, right? And that's a belief that you have about other possible worlds or about what would be rational to believe if you imaginatively added this sort of supposition, the antecedent, to your stock of beliefs. Okay? Okay, so that's conditionals. They're weird, right? They're weirder than you might suppose on first inspection, and the debate goes on about exactly how to analyze these things. Like, yeah, okay, but that's probably plenty for our purposes. I just wanted to give you a little bit of that was a little more philosophy than I usually do, but I wanted to give you a little taste of what philosophers are saying about these counterfactual claims. Okay. Any questions on that stuff? Comments, objections? No? Okay, good. So the thing to do now is to move on to complex argument diagrams. Actually, to begin, you're not doing particularly complex argument diagrams. So let's start by just doing the first page. So the first page, 1 to 8. And all I'm going to ask you to do is sort of like draw brackets around the premises and the conclusion, indicate which is which, and then draw me a little argument diagram for each of these. And I'll just ask you to follow a couple of, just for fun, here's an argument diagram of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. This is a bit of 400-page book, and here's the structure of his argument. I just like to put a little contrast class for you to show you how easy it is, the thing that we're doing. For our purposes, this diagram is actually upside down, because I'm going to ask you to make all of your diagrams have the conclusion at the bottom. This has got the conclusion, transcendental idealism is true, is his ultimate conclusion. That's the name of his philosophy. And all of these are the parts of his argument that are supposed to lead up to that. Yeah. And each one of the little ones, each one of those tiny little things at the very bottom of there is not just like a sentence, it's a chapter of his book. It's like a subsection of the Critique of Pure Reason, which is about 400 pages long or something. So be glad that we're not doing that. Instead, let's just do some smallish argument diagrams. And I'll ask you to follow just a couple of diagramming conventions. These are really conventional. Actually, the third one's not really conventional, it's important, but stuff like conclusions always go at the bottom. People are often tempted to do it side to side, and I understand why you would, but just so that we all do the same thing, always put your conclusion at the bottom. You can repeat premises as necessary. I don't think it's necessary in any of these ones, but as we get more complex, sometimes you need a premise more than once. That's fine, just use it more than once. And this one is important, and we get people who do this all the time. So arrows always lead either from one premise to another. So like P1 can lead to P2, which leads to a conclusion, right? One premise to one premise, or a dependent relation between two or more premises to another premise, right? But here's what they never do. Here's what arrows are never supposed to do. lead from a premise or a dependent relation to like a whole line, right? These arrows indicate what is being justified. So it has to point to either P2 or P4, not kind of in the middle, right? Don't draw me a diagram that says P1 and P3 lead to both P2 and P4. Tell me exactly which premise is being justified. You should be able to do that in every case, okay? Is there something, I'm sure there are other small conventions that I'm not thinking of, but they'll hopefully emerge as we get into this. Okay, so is that fairly clear what the task is? And tell me whether, so map the following arguments and indicate whether they're valid or invalid. So indicate whether you think that they are either deductively valid, inductively valid, or invalid. Okay? Okay, let's do that now and come back together whenever you're done. Just do the first page, and then I propose to work through the ones on the second page together, kind of one by one. Right? And that's what we have planned for the rest of the class. So, again, please feel free to work together. It's easier and funner and more productive if you talk to somebody about it, or not, which is also fine. All right. Okay, so let's just do these one by one and sort of compare and discuss. So, map the following arguments and indicate whether they are valid or invalid. Birds fly and penguins are birds, so that means penguins can fly. So, okay, so first of all, what's the conclusion? Let's always start, so whenever you're breaking down an argument for the whole rest of the semester, always start from the conclusion. Always start by trying to identify what the argument is aimed at, because if you can't figure that out, you won't figure out any of the rest of the structure, right? And it's crucially important. You'll get a totally different structure if you identify something else as the conclusion. So, what's the conclusion? Yeah. Penguins can fly, and that's indicated by the inference indicator, so that means, right? So that means is kind of one of those things that tells you, here comes the conclusion. Good. Conclusion, and now these two things are premises, right? Birds fly and penguins are birds. Right? Premise one, penguins are birds. Good. Now, are those dependent or independent reasons to believe the conclusion? Dependent. They are dependent. It's an instance of a categorical, right? This category has this property. This thing is a member of that category. Therefore, this thing has that property. So they are dependent reasons. Is it valid? Is this a valid argument? Yes. Yes. It is not sound, right? Because birds fly if it's okay. Actually, let me be more precise than that, because we just talked about the difference between universals and universals and generics. So if birds fly means all birds fly, then this is a valid argument. It's unsound because it's false that all birds fly. If birds fly means some birds fly or generally birds fly, then you cannot validly infer from that penguins are birds, therefore penguins fly. Right? So whether this argument is valid or invalid depends on how you interpret that first sentence as either a universal or a generic sentence. Yeah? Okay, so well, if you wrote, so if I gave you this and you said, well, it depends whether you interpret the first premise as either a universal or generic, that would be a 100% right answer. On something like on the test, I'm really going to try not to do that. Okay? But so does that make sense to everybody? Did anybody get a different answer or anything sort of like that they want to discuss about that? Okay, so valid if all birds fly, invalid if generally birds fly. Does that sound fair to you? Good. So now I'm glad that we talked about generics before this thing. So, all right. My neighbors are just the worst. They play their music so loud and they leave their garbage on the fire escape. Now, what is the conclusion? Yeah. My neighbors are worse. To me, that looks like definitely what this thing is meant to show. And the other two things, so, like, hopefully that's intuitive to you, but I don't know how to explain much further if it's not how you figured out that that's the conclusion, other than the fact that if you assume that that's the conclusion, the other parts look like evidence for it, right? So it's like you pick out the conclusion in part by figuring out what all the evidence being presented points at, but you also figure out how the evidence works by working out what the conclusion is. It's a kind of like reflective equilibrium that you have to do between imagining different parts of it or the conclusion and saying, now does this argument make any sense? So one way of making this an argument that makes sense is to identify that as the conclusion, and then that makes these other two things premises, because I think I'm not giving you any things that aren't premises in this. It's just all just either premises or conclusions. So there's P1. And I'll ask, so as we get into this, the premises will look less cleanly like premises, and you'll have to do some editing and rephrasing to get them to be nice premises. Your premises should just be statements that are supposed to be factual, right? So, and you leave out things like the and, or the therefore, or any connectives, or any kind of like extra commentary. The premises should just be, a premise is basically got to be a statement of fact that's potentially true or false, right? Not a command or an instruction or a question or anything like that, right? Okay, so my neighbors are just the worst. They play their music so loud, they leave their garbage on the fire escape. Now, so we've got, is it a dependent or independent relationship between those two premises and the conclusion? I would say independent, right? Either one of those things would be at least reasonable evidence that the conclusion is true. Or at least it should raise the credibility you give to the hypothesis that the conclusion is true. Now, is it deductively valid, inductively valid, or invalid? I would say it's inductively valid, right? These genuinely are pieces of evidence that should raise the credibility of your belief that my neighbors are just the worst. I'm not sure, so this is where you should be glad that we're just drawing arrows rather than citing logical rules, because I don't know what logical rule you would cite to describe the relationship between these premises and the conclusion, right? Just you have in your mind a category of things that make somebody the worst kind of neighbor, and that these are two things that are in that category or something like that. Like it's a very informal inference, right? So it's definitely not deductive, and it's a medium strength inductive argument at best. Nonetheless, it's an argument, and it's, let's call it inductively valid. Okay? It's okay to call something inductively valid even if it's not that strong, so long as it's just not totally invalid. All right. I'm pretty sure that the so-called prime minister is an alien. He's got this weird look in his eye, and that is a sure sign of being an alien. Okay. The conclusion of this argument is, I'm pretty sure the prime minister is an alien. Right? Okay, and then we got these two things as premises. P1. Again, I'm cutting out the connective, the and, because we're just trying to isolate the statements of facts that are supposed to be evidence for the conclusion. Right. Now, are these independent or dependent? Dependent, right? Once again, you can apply the puzzle piece rule. He's got a weird look in his eye. And in this case, and that refers to that he has a weird look in his eye, right? So you have to kind of rephrase this one to use the puzzle piece method, but you should be able to see that if you unpack the meaning of that, it refers to that thing in the first premise, and that falls out, and you get he's an alien. Yeah?
When we were asked to map the following arguments, do we have to draw out the thing that
Yeah, I was hoping that you would do argument diagrams. I'm not doing argument diagrams for these ones because there's only two argument diagrams that are possible here. Given just two premises and a conclusion, there are literally only two argument diagrams possible. P1, P2, leading to independently to the conclusion, or P1, P2 leading dependently to the conclusion. Right? Those are the only two. So if I write independent, it's this argument diagram. If I write dependent, it's this argument diagram. Yeah? So, right. Now, so this will be no good. This method of just me just writing down whether it's dependent or independent will be no good when we get to the second half of this, because there'll be many more possible, as soon as you move past two premises, there are many more possible argument diagrams for you to sort of like search through. So I'll have to actually draw them out. But so far we're okay. So there are dependent reasons. Is this a valid argument? Or is it inductively, deductively, or invalid? It's actually deductively valid. It's deductively valid. That's so okay. So the conclusion: Prime Minister is an alien. Let's call that A. That's our sentence A. The conclusion we're trying to show. So he's got a weird look in his eye. So J has A, and you say, sorry. J has E. This weird look in his eye. All E's are A's. Therefore, J is an A. Right? If you strip away the nonsensical surface structure and get to the form of the argument, you can see that if those two premises were true, if it was true that he has a weird look in his eye, and that if you've got a weird look in an eye, then you're definitely an alien, then it must be true that you're an alien. I don't know why I always go to alien things. I guess to try to, like, one of the things I'm trying to do for you here is to help you separate thinking that something kind of makes sense in a holistic sense. Like, this argument obviously makes no sense when you consider, like, reality and what's actually going on, but you should see that it's deductively valid nonetheless. Yeah?
For this example, could you argue it two ways? Like, I kind of said it would be deductively valid.
Yeah?
But it could also be invalid if you were to say that, like, the premise two, like, premise one, he's got a weird look in his eye is almost like a fact.
Yeah?
And then to say that look is a sure sign of being an alien, that could just be an opinion, like, it's
Okay.
not really factual. So could you say it's not a premise?
Okay, so the question is, premise one looks factual, premise two looks questionable or like a matter of opinion, and therefore could it potentially be invalid? Just for the people listening at home. I would say that, okay, so this is important. You have to kind of know. No, it doesn't, that one of the premises is questionable or like just a matter of opinion, or that there's no evidence for, like, there's absolutely no evidence that you can look at somebody in the eye and tell they're an alien, right? That's absurd, clearly false. But that it's false has no impact on whether it's valid or not, right? It has a definitive impact on whether it's sound. So the falseness of P2 makes this definitely an unsound argument, even if it does turn out to be valid, which I think it is. So it's deductively valid, clearly unsound because it's got a garbage premise in it, of course. Like, it's not true that the Prime Minister is an alien. But that the premises are unjustified doesn't feature at all in whether the argument itself is valid. It's just the form of the argument that tells you that. So the method is maybe like, forget everything that you know about any of these concepts, right? The content of the concepts really can't tell you much about whether it's deductively valid, at least. So if it's deductively valid, you don't need to know anything about what J is, what E is, what A is. You just need to know the structure. And it could be that all of the premises and the conclusion are just totally bonkers and false, but it's nonetheless a deductively valid argument. This is like, this is one of those crucial points that we're trying to, like, slowly and agonizingly tease out things making sense, in the sense of, like, yeah, I get that, those are plausible, that's a reasonable thing to say, from an argument being valid. Right? And the reason to tease these apart is those are two basically different ways of objecting to somebody's argument. Right? So if somebody gives you an argument, there could be two basically different categories of things that are wrong with it. Could be that the premises are false, or it could be that the premises don't validly entail the conclusion, right? So you can minimize the conflict in your debates by figuring out which one of those is the problem. So you can say to somebody, yeah, I mean, I agree that all of these things that you're saying are true. I'm just disagreeing that they lead to the conclusion that we're debating about. Or you could say, yeah, I agree that all of those, the inferences you're making are good ones. If those things were true, they would totally lead to the conclusion, but they don't, right? They're not, or sorry, they totally would lead if they were true, but turns out they're not true. So you can kind of localize your disagreement. And as I've been trying to emphasize, the key to having a productive argument is to maximize agreement. Maximize the number of things that you can agree on, because then you have some common ground to try to convince the other person using their own beliefs to believe what you want, right? So that's why we're doing this. That's why we're trying to tease apart validity from soundness or something like that, or the truth of the premises. And it's just like, it's counterintuitive. It really is counterintuitive. Your brain is not set up to do this unless you kind of beat it into it. So let's continue the beating. All right. Okay, so I'm going to call this deductively valid. All right. You aren't getting any younger, and I've got a job. We should get married. Okay, there's no inference indicator in there. But what's the conclusion? We should get married. All right. Which means the other two parts are premises, because that's the way this exercise is set up. P1 and P2. So are these meant to be dependent or independent premises? Independent premises. And is this deductively, inductively valid, or invalid? Yeah, like, this is a really terrible argument. This is one of the worst. I think this is the worst argument on the thing. Like, none of us are getting any younger. Nobody ever gets any younger. It's a dumb thing to say. And having a job in no way qualifies a person. I would say that having a job in no way qualifies you as a potential mate, really. Like, I don't think that's in any way sufficient, especially in a country with like 95% employment. Like, this is not a reason. Like, if you wanted to call it inductively valid, you'd have to assign it the lowest degree of validity that's possible. Like, these are just barely reasons. If they're reasons at all, they're just barely reasons. So let's call it just barely valid. Not cussed, just barely valid, if at all. All right. All right. You must have ID to get into the bar. You didn't bring your ID, so you're not getting in. Conclusion. I didn't copy edit this well. So what do you think the conclusion is now that I've erased my... All right. Yeah? Question? Oh, yeah, it's just, yeah, okay. Okay. And obviously these are premises, and are these dependent or independent premises? Dependent, right. And is this inductively valid, deductively valid, or invalid? Deductively valid, that's right. So these are dependent, deductively valid. Good. Any questions about that one? This should be fairly straightforward. There's a rule, you're applying the rule, therefore, yeah? Sure, yeah. Sorry?
Can you just say it's invalid?
That it's just barely valid? I think you can. So, okay, so why not just call this plainly invalid? Because with inductive arguments, we're into the great, brutal, messy world of figuring out what's relevant, right? So are those factors, the fact that literally all of us are getting older all the time and that this human is employed, are those relevant to whether somebody should get married? And I would assign them an extremely low degree of relevance. Like, these are not good reasons. But that's not the same as saying that they are zero reasons at all. So to say that it's completely invalid kind of says these are just unrelated. They're completely unrelated to the conclusion. Having a job might be related, like you might be economically dependent on somebody. So it might be related to whether you should marry them. Like they might pay for some of your life, right? That's partly why I married my wife, because it's cheaper to live with two people than to live alone. Like it's not very romantic, I'm sorry, but like that is literally part of the reason why people get married, is that it's economically advantageous to them to do it. So in that sense, I'm not getting older is, I would say, zero reason at all. You're not getting younger, zero reason at all. And I've got a job, but I would suggest that I've got a job might not be zero reason. Does that make sense? Like, it's an ugly reason. It's an unpleasant reason. Yeah, like okay, so let's carefully distinguish this, right? So I dislike this argument intensely, despite having written it. I'm not sure why I phrased it this way, but like it's an ugly reason. It's gross, and you shouldn't say it. But those are, strictly speaking, separate factors than whether the argument is valid or not, right? Or the degree to which the argument is valid. Now, if you believe that your employment status is completely irrelevant, then you believe that this argument is completely invalid. So that's, I guess, the point at which you might have a debate, and like that's dependent on so much about society and our lives and like what the economy is going to do, and like all of this intensely complex social stuff is all packed into the question: is having a job relevant to whether you should marry somebody? So say it's complicated. Is that like? So well, I mean, this is literally one of the lessons of this class. Is when you're in the world of deductive reasoning, there are real, definite answers to all these questions. There are one and only one answer to any kind of question about whether an argument is valid or not. And that's just not the case for most of the things that we talk about and care about. Questions like, it should be super straightforward, right? I just put is it valid or invalid, like the end. But the question in the messy world of inductive reasoning, like, you have to answer questions about what's important or what's, like part of, so there's, I'd like to, okay, this is probably a good time to point this out. So there's a should in this conclusion, isn't there? And that's like a normative claim. That's not just a claim about what's true in the world, it's a claim about what people ought to do. And Hume says this is not a good way to read. So the premises are claims about facts, right? Observable facts. Either you have a job or you don't. Either time continues to go forward or it doesn't, right? So those are just observable facts. You can check them. You could check them in a laboratory probably. The conclusion says something about what people ought to do. And to really justify it, Hume says you need a normative premise in there. You need some premise about what makes a life worth living, or like what a good life looks like, or what your moral duties and obligations are, right? So you need an ethical theory to back up any inference from facts to normative claims. You need some ethical theory to like make up the difference. Now, we're just kind of fudging it for now. I bet you looked at this and didn't blink about it. You're like, no, I totally see the relationship between these, because you're bringing your values to bear in your reasoning all the time. But in this very simple looking inference, there's this value judgment being made. And that makes relevant to this question, like, your whole image of what a good human life looks like, right? So it's complicated. I think is the shortest possible answer to this. Like, let's leave it at that. So I really seriously like. I think that's the actual answer, that it's complicated, and it depends on, if you think the whole point of life is to work as little as possible and to in as much material wealth as possible, maybe marrying for money is a really good idea for you. Like if that's your sincerely held belief about what a good life looks like, then that might make a lot of sense. I got a lot of money, you should marry me. Okay, that fulfills my life goals, I should do that. I hope most of you don't have those as your life goals, but if you did, then this would make sense, right? So we're going to do a class on normativity where we get, I'll stop fudging it and we'll actually talk about what's true. But for now, anytime there's a should in a conclusion and there's no should in the premises, that should set off a little alert in the back of your head saying, ah, it's funny business going on here. Somebody's not being explicit about all of their premises. Okay. This is why I put garbage arguments on these exercises, by the way. I know that most of these are garbage arguments. The problem is to figure out why they're garbage arguments, and it's sometimes much more complicated than it looks like. Okay, okay. From the lofty heights to bagels. Bagels taste great, so they make a great breakfast. Also, you can put cream cheese on them. What's the conclusion of this argument? I think it's they make a great breakfast. So the thing that should twig you to that is the so. The so is an inference indicator that means that was a premise, here comes a conclusion. Now, it's in the middle, it's awkwardly put, like usually the conclusion. If you're writing well, the conclusion should come first or last. That's how you kind of pick it out for people, but it often comes in the middle because not everybody's a great writer. So the so tells you that the second half is the conclusion. And then once you realize that this is the conclusion, you can see that the third thing is evidence for it as well. Right? So bagels taste great is a reason to believe that they make a great breakfast. Also, you can put cream cheese on them. Again, cut out the also because it's sort of a connective with other sentences. You just want to isolate the statement of fact. Right, okay. So once you realize what the conclusion is, once you know the conclusion, the structure of the thing should kind of pop out. Now, are these dependent or independent reasons for the conclusion? Independent, and then this is inductive or deductive? Inductive, I would say. Inductive, I would say. There's not that tight logical relation between the premises and the conclusion. Like that you can put cream cheese on something doesn't guarantee that it makes a great breakfast. What's that? Is it invalid? I thought it was inductively valid. Well, tasting great is one of the reasons why something is a great breakfast, isn't it? What do you look for in your breakfast? Nutrition is also a thing that you can look for in a breakfast. It is also, that would make an adequate breakfast. I'm not sure if it makes a great breakfast. So I guess it depends on whether you think the ability to put cream cheese on something makes it part of a great breakfast. It's weak evidence at best, right? Okay, so look, I'm hearing invalid over here. Can we hear the reason why? No? Do you want to tell us, do you say it's invalid?
I didn't say it was invalid. I said you can put cream cheese on them doesn't exactly lead to it makes a great breakfast because I don't see the connection to it.
Right.
If I hate cream cheese, what if cream cheese is bad for my health?
Good.
Yeah, so
Good.
I think that there's only one premise, and the second one is just like extra detail.
Okay, okay. So I think that is a reasonable way of parsing this. One of the things that we could do, so you could either read, well, okay, the thing that makes me inclined to read the third sentence as a premise is the also. Oh. Okay, so you could reasonably think that the third sentence was just somebody saying something. But what we can do here, so suppose you hate cream cheese. Suppose this is being said to somebody who's like, I hate cream cheese, and then somebody offers you this argument. Then you're really not going to think that the relationship between P2 and the conclusion works at all, right? So what you're saying here and what we can do once you start breaking down an argument, you can say P1 is relevant to the conclusion. P1 to conclusion is a relevant sort of like inferential relationship. P2 to the conclusion is not, right? Especially in the context of I hate cream cheese, right? So in that context, you want to be able to, what we can do is say, look, we're not going to just condemn this whole argument. Sure, that it tastes great, that's relevant to the conclusion. It's not the only thing that might be relevant to the conclusion. You might care about nutrition, or you might care about like how easy it is to get or where you're eating it. So lots of other things that could be relevant. So this is inductively relevant to the conclusion. What you could say about P2 is, look, I don't think that's even inductively relevant to the conclusion. I think it's irrelevant, right? Does that sound right? Good, good. So let's go with that. So P1 to C is inductively valid. inductively valid. P2 to C is not. Does that sound fair? Yeah?
I'm still not sure about P1 being inductively valid to C, because if it's basically then it's good food, but it's not specifically a great breakfast.
Right, right. So that's certainly, so what he said is, if it tastes great, that means it's good food, but not necessarily good breakfast. So that's true. I think that's true. Like, that a pizza tastes great is not evidence that it makes a good breakfast. However, so what that tells us is that P1 is not sufficient to establish the conclusion, right? So, well, no, because a reason can be insufficient but still relevant, right? So it's not, P1 by itself is not enough all by itself to establish the conclusion. That's what it means to say that it's not sufficient. But you can give necessary but insufficient reasons. So you might want to say that tasting great is a necessary condition for something to be part of a great breakfast. So if you establish it, you're establishing part of the argument for the conclusion. It's at least relevant to the conclusion, right? So you say, no great breakfast tastes bad, bagels taste great, therefore bagels potentially make a great breakfast, something like that, like if you want to be more precise about the way you phrased it. So similarly, like if I say, I saw 5 ducks today, and then my evidence is I saw a duck this morning and I saw a duck this afternoon, neither of those is sufficient to establish that I saw 5 ducks, right? By themselves, those premises are only enough to show that I saw 2 ducks. However, that doesn't make them irrelevant, right? It's not that they're unrelated to the claim that I saw 5 ducks today, right? So something can be relevant but not by itself sufficient to establish the conclusion, right? Certainly not deductively. Like, this is definitely not deductively valid, right? For sure, and that's what insufficiency shows you. So you know for sure if the premise is insufficient to show the conclusion, then it's not by itself deductively valid reason for the conclusion. If we're talking about the world of induction or like non-deductive inferences, then it can be relevant but not enough by itself. You'd want more evidence, but just because you want more doesn't mean that what you were offered isn't evidence. Yeah? How are we doing here? Good. That was more controversy than I expected the bagel question to generate. Good. Okay, nobody likes Jerry. He's got the worst laugh, P1. I think that's a premise, probably. Oh, man. Sorry. I submitted a grant application yesterday, so I'm a little beat up. All right. So what's the conclusion here? Nobody likes Jerry. Poor Jerry. All right, and then the other 2 things are premises. And are they, again, cutting out the and, cutting out the connective because it's not part of the proposition. The proposition just says this object has this property. So, and you can't, are they dependent or independent reasons? Dependent reasons. And is this inductive or deductive? So remember, to judge whether something is deductively valid, imagine that the premises are true and then ask yourself, does this guarantee the conclusion? So I'm tempted to say that this is deductive. I'm tempted to say that it's deductive because you can't get along. So he's got the worst laugh, so he's got this problem. So Jerry has worst laugh. If worst laugh, then like no friends, basically. Therefore, G has no friends. So you've got to massage it a little bit to get it into the form of the modus ponens here, right? You have to rephrase bits of it. But if you're willing to accept that what's written on the page here is equivalent to this slightly rephrased argument, then you should think that it's deductively valid. Now the question is, was that rephrasing, did the massaging that we just did to get it sort of jammed into this form preserve what's important about what was written down? And that's a matter of interpretation. Usually, often, it's a matter of judgment, and you typically have to use context to figure it out. I think in this case, you could say you can't get along with somebody like that. Could be rephrased to, for all people, if they have this property, then they have no friends or something like that, or that nobody will get along with them. So it's that you can't. Yeah?
But how is it necessarily true? Like, if he's got a worse laugh, how is it true that because he has got a worse laugh, nobody will get along with him?
Right. So the question is, why is it true that if you've got the worst laugh, then you can't get along with somebody like that? But that's not what's being claimed here, right? Because it's that would be, so what that would be P1 leading to P2, which then leads to P3, right? Or sorry, the conclusion, right? So this is where one premise is a reason to believe another premise, which is then a reason to believe the conclusion. But I don't think that's what's going on here. P1 is not being offered as an argument for P2. You're saying P1 got the worst laugh, P2, if you have the worst laugh, then you have no friends, therefore no friends. Right? So what's being offered are a conditional statement and something that satisfies the antecedent of the conditional, and then you get the conclusion. It's not that he's got the worst laugh is evidence for the conditional itself. And this is why it's important to keep conditionals whole. Don't split them up into separate sentences, right? So it's not that the conditional is being argued for by the first premise. It's the conditional is being offered to you as a premise. There's nothing in this argument that tells you why you should believe either of the premises, right? Just like literally all arguments where premises are introduced, the top level premises are unargued for. You got to have some premises you're not arguing for. It's not the case that it's not the case that premises are never argued for. This is a case where one premise is given a reason for another premise, right? But there's always a top level. So these are the top level ones. No reason is given to believe these. Probably there's no reason to believe these, but nonetheless, I take it this is the structure. Okay, so, and are you happy with that it's deductive? Reasonably happy? Okay. Which shows you like what it's worth to call something deductive. It's fine, but it doesn't mean you have the truth, right? Because you have to have the premises be true. And the tighter the premises are, the tighter the relation between the premises, often the harder it is to show that they're true, right? So premise 2 has to be really strong here. It has to be a really strong claim for this to be deductive, that if you got the worst laugh, then you must have no friends, and we're confident about that. That seems like an inductive claim with very little support. Yeah?
Can the premises be independent if you can't get along with something like that? It doesn't refer to the laugh, but how Jerry is.
Yes. Yes. So the question is, could they be independent if the that in that sentence has a different reference than the first sentence? So I was assuming that P2 here is referring to that refers to he's got the worst laugh. But if it's just like you can't get along with somebody that's like Jerry in general, then it would be two independent reasons for the conclusion. Good. Okay. Deductive. So philosophy isn't practical, and only practical disciplines are useful. So this course will be mostly useless. So what's the conclusion? Yeah, you got it. This course will be mostly useless. This is the thing that maximizes like the evidence of the rest of it. So the rest of it looks like good reasons to believe this conclusion, if true. So that means this P1, and again, cutting out the and, cutting out the connective between the two, P2. Okay, so are these dependent or independent reasons for the conclusion? They are dependent reasons, right? Good old puzzle piece method tells us that. We're probably not going to get to the other side of this class. So they are dependent, and is this inductive or deductive? Deductive. It's a deductively valid argument. So this thing has this property, this category has this property. Anything in this category of philosophical things, has the property of being impractical. Only disciplines that are useful are practical, so this course will be mostly useless. Yeah?
But can she also say that it's
Aha, interesting. Okay, so yeah, so just for the recording, the question is, given that P2 says only, and given the conclusion says mostly, isn't this invalid? Now, so in this case, it's a bit weird, right? Because the conclusion seems to be weaker than what the premises could justify. So you're using these premises, philosophy isn't practical, only practical disciplines are useful. Those are very strong claims, and they could be used to justify the conclusion, so this course will be useless, right? So this course will not be useful, right? And that's a stronger claim than this course will be mostly useless, which is, it looks like you're marshaling more evidence than you need to establish this conclusion. But I would say that something that is completely useless is also mostly useless. For anything that's completely useless is also mostly useless, and a little bit more. That violates, so saying that violates some of the norms of conversation, and we'll do a class that includes at least the sort of Grice's rules of conversational implicature. So if and one of the rules is provide enough information, but not more information that you need. Right? So in this case, it looks like you're providing a stronger reason than needed for your conclusion, which is weird. It's a weird way of speaking, and it kind of violates the ways we expect people to act cooperatively, but it's not a logical error. So if I say, you know, most squares have triangles, I'm not wrong, I'm just being bizarre, right? Yeah? That's right. So that's the implicature, the conversational implicature. So if you say it's mostly useless, but it's completely useless, you're offering more information than was necessary in that context, right? You could have just said it's useless, and then you didn't need to add the modifier. The modifier is like hanging there being unhelpful. So like, if you say something like, everybody in this room is smart except Katie, and also Katie's smart, you haven't actually contradicted yourself. Right? So you're saying just for the set of all people that are not Katie, I don't know if there is a Katie in this room, I'm sorry I'm saying this about you, but if you're picking up the whole class of non-Katie people and you took a little bit of care to do that, it's implied that you did it for some reason. You're trying to communicate something by adding the extra parts to that discussion. And that's just, but that's not a logical rule exactly. That's a rule that's generated from the assumption that people are trying to be cooperative in conversations. Like it's that we're trying to help each other out, you're trying to give people what they need and be useful and work together and stuff like that. So those are the rules of kind of what they call conversational implicature. If I, you know, like, if you say something ominous like, you know, some of you will not pass this test, it's like, well, why is he saying that? Like, we knew that, right? We knew that there's not going to be a 100% success rate. Why is he giving us this information? That implies it's got ominous, weird implications, right? But logically speaking, all it says is there'll be more than 0 people who fail the test. So those are the difference between the kind of logical structure of the sentence and the implicature of the sentence. I do want to talk a little bit about implicatures because it's helpful for you trying to be helpful with other humans. So. And it's also useful when you're trying to diagnose what's gone wrong with an argument. Sometimes it's a failure of implicature, not a failure of the logic. And logic-y type people love this situation because they can just dig in their heels and say, no, logically speaking, most is compatible with all, you know, and they get all high on logic. So it would be nice for you to have some tools to say like, yes, I understand that, but also there are these rules about like people trying to be reasonable with each other in conversation, and that's what's the problem here. So. We'll do a class on that. Great. And deductively valid. Good. Okay. All cats are cute and Dory is a cat. Oh wait, no, okay, so that was the first page. That was the whole first page. Okay, is that enough for today? I think that's enough for today. So we'll do the other side. Please, if you want to try this, and should we take these up in class next time maybe? Okay, so try these on your own, and we'll take them up in class on Tuesday.